The movie begins by introducing the life of a struggling salesman named Chris. He faces many hardships but keeps working hard, never giving up. So, do not consider him a regular man, as his life journey is a motivation for everyone who dreams big and believes in achieving it. As the story unfolds, we discover that Chris sells medical devices called bone density scanners to earn money. Every day he drops his son off at school and then spends the rest of his time trying to sell his product. He sets a goal to sell at least one device each month. However, every time he visits hospitals, the management rejects his offer, saying they don't need it. Meanwhile, his wife also has a job. One day, Chris asks her to pick up their son, but she refuses, explaining that she is already working double shifts. Later that night, while they're having dinner, Chris notices a Rubik's Cube and starts solving it. His wife, worried about their finances, asks if he has paid the taxes. Chris admits that he asked for more time, making her even more concerned. The next morning, after she leaves for work, Chris continues working on the puzzle, calling it an easy task. That day, while trying to sell his device again, Chris notices a wealthy businessman sitting in a luxury car. Curious, he asks the man what he does for a living. The businessman replies that he is a stockbroker. Intrigued, Chris asks if a lot of education is required for the job. The man explains that it is not necessary, but emphasizes the importance of hard work and specific skills. This conversation leaves Chris deep in thought, wondering when he will experience happiness like the successful people around him. The next day, Chris tells his wife that he will be home late because he has applied for a stockbroker internship. She dismisses his plans, reminding him that they only have 2 months left to pay rent. Determined, Chris heads to the stockbroker's office. Since he is not allowed to bring his medical device inside, he leaves it with a woman standing outside. While filling out his job application, Chris glances outside and realizes that the woman has disappeared with his device. Panicked, he rushes out of the office, grabs his application form, and runs after her. However, she has already boarded a train, leaving him devastated. That same day, Chris had promised his wife that he would sell the device. Feeling overwhelmed, he fills out his job application the next morning and submits it to the stockbroker's office. As he leaves, he suddenly spots the same woman who stole his device. Without hesitation, he runs after her. Desperate, he explains that he invested all his savings in the device, and losing it would mean losing his entire month's income. Despite his struggles, Chris remains devoted to his son. On his son's birthday, he gifts him a basketball. Later, while trying to sell his device again, Chris crosses paths with the stockbroker office's dean, who reminds him that his application was submitted a month ago. The dean, in a hurry, tells Chris that he has to leave immediately. Eager to talk to him, Chris asks for a moment of his time, insisting that they are heading to the same destination. The two share a cab ride. During the ride, Chris tries to impress the dean by talking about his skills and abilities. However, the dean is more focused on solving a Rubik's Cube. He hands the puzzle to Chris and challenges him to solve it. Before the cab reaches its stop, Chris completes the puzzle, impressing the dean. As the cab stops, the dean gets out, but it becomes clear that Chris is expected to pay the fare. With no money to cover the cost, Chris quickly exits the cab and runs away. He hurriedly boards a train, but in the rush, one of his hands is left outside the closing doors, the same hand holding his medical device. Later that day, Chris calls his wife to apologize for not making it home on time. However, she is furious as his delay caused her to miss work. Frustrated, she tells him that she is leaving and taking their son with her. When Chris finally returns home, he finds that both his wife and son are gone. That same day, he receives an unexpected call from the dean, who provides the contact number of his secretary, instructing him to call and discuss the job opportunity. Without a pen and paper, Chris quickly memorizes the number and rushes to a nearby store to write it down. Later, Chris unexpectedly runs into his wife. She is extremely frustrated, making it clear that she is unhappy with their situation. She feels that Chris is not taking responsibility seriously and isn't providing the stability they need. Chris listens to her complaints in silence before finally saying that no matter what happens, their son will stay with him. That same day, Chris takes his son home. Soon after, their landlord arrives to collect the overdue rent. Chris pleads for more time, promising to pay as soon as possible. The landlord agrees to give him a few more days. The day before his interview, Chris agrees to paint his apartment for free so his landlord won't evict him for late rent. While he is busy painting, someone knocks on the door. When he opens it, 2 police officers stand outside. They have come to arrest him for unpaid parking fines. Chris immediately pays the fine, but one of the officers explains that the payment won't be processed until the next day, so he still has to go with them. Realizing he won't be able to pick up his son from school, Chris calls his wife and asks her to do it instead. She agrees. Unfortunately, he also has an important job interview that same day. As soon as he is released, he rushes to the interview without changing his clothes because there is no time. When he arrives, the interviewers are surprised to see him in messy, paint-stained clothes. Chris explains that he was detained by the police and came straight from there. The panel finds his story interesting, and although he makes them laugh, the company's head isn't too impressed. Still, they offer him an unpaid internship. Chris hesitates since he needs money to support his son, but the dean encourages him to take the opportunity. Later that night, Chris returns home to find his wife and son waiting. After their son falls asleep, his wife tells him she's leaving for New York to work as a waitress. Chris insists that their son should stay with him, and she agrees, believing he will take better care of the boy. Though sad, she has no other choice. The next morning, Chris takes his son to a hospital, hoping to sell his medical device for some money. Luckily, the hospital agrees to buy it, giving him some financial relief. Feeling hopeful, he decides to focus on his internship and make the most of the opportunity. One day, as Chris is leaving work, he spots a man carrying a medical device just like the one he lost. He immediately runs after him, hoping to get it back. But in his hurry, he gets hit by a car. When he looks down, he realizes one of his shoes is missing. Still, he keeps chasing the man with only one shoe, but he can't catch him. Despite all the struggles, Chris remains dedicated to his internship, though he isn't making much progress. One day, he sees the company's CEO and tries to approach him. But before he can say anything, his supervisor interrupts and asks him to move his car. Frustrated, Chris misses the chance to talk to the CEO. That night, Chris promises his son that if he helps him prepare for an important meeting the next day, they will go watch a basketball game together. The next morning, he goes to the CEO's house and finally gets a chance to present his ideas. The CEO is impressed and invites Chris and his son to the basketball game. While watching, the CEO tells Chris that he likes his ideas and won't reject any of his proposals. Chris feels hopeful that his life is finally changing for the better. Just as things seem to be improving, Chris faces another financial setback. A portion of his money is deducted from his bank account due to unpaid taxes, leaving him with very little. Desperate, he goes to a friend who borrowed money from him, hoping to get it back. But the friend denies owing him anything and shuts the door in his face. With no other options, Chris focuses on selling another medical device. He goes from one hospital to another, trying to find a buyer. Finally, a hospital agrees to purchase it, but only if he repairs it first. This creates another challenge since he has no money left for repairs. That evening, when Chris returns home, he finds all his belongings outside. His landlord has evicted him for not paying rent. Chris tries to unlock the door, but the locks have been changed. With nowhere to go, he takes his son to a train station for shelter. To comfort him, he pretends the medical device is a time machine and says they are traveling to the world of dinosaurs. His son plays along, excited by the idea. That night, they sleep in a public restroom. As his son dozes off, Chris sits in the dark, silently crying. The next morning, Chris looks for shelter, but the first place only accepts women and children. The second one turns them away. After much struggle, they finally find a shelter that allows them to stay. Determined to fix the medical device, Chris works hard to repair it while continuing his internship. One evening, as he prepares for an important exam, he runs into the company's head, who needs money to pay a cab driver. Even though Chris barely has enough for himself, he hands over the cash without hesitation. To survive, Chris even donates blood for money. Using this small amount, he finally repairs the medical device. One night at the shelter, his son asks him if his mother left because of him. Chris reassures him that there's no need to worry. His son looks at him and says, "You're the best father." These words give Chris the strength to keep going. After fixing the device, Chris successfully sells it and makes a decent amount of money. He and his son move into a hotel, finally escaping homelessness. To celebrate, they spend time at the beach, enjoying a rare moment of peace. A few days later, Chris's hard work pays off. The dean of the stockbroker company congratulates him for bringing in so many clients. On the last day of his internship, Chris wears a clean shirt for the first time in a long while. When he walks into the office, everyone greets him with appreciation. Then, his supervisor looks at him and says, "Come back tomorrow wearing that same shirt. You've got the job." Overwhelmed with emotion, Chris holds back his tears. His supervisor even returns the money he borrowed for the cab ride. As Chris steps outside, he realizes this is the happiest moment of his life. He runs to his son, hugs him tightly, and smiles, knowing all his struggles are worth it. Chris has faced countless hardships, but he overcomes every single one. In the end, he not only secures a stable job, but also closes a multi-million-dollar deal, marking the beginning of a bright future for himself and his son.